influential guy in town that wore a hearing aid, and he went into a board meeting and they were talking seriously where our sales are up, and he quit talking like that.
Mm-hmm.
And the guy's sitting here slapping his ear.
He did it for fun?
Yeah, he did it as a joke. And, I guess he let everybody else in on it. And he's sitting here slapping his ear thinking his hearing aid went out, and it was just funny. This is the same guy, this highly intelligent man, was sitting in the office next to me, and a friend of mine, a missionary, had given me a letter opener of some red ebony wood, and it was made in a leper colony. And so here's this highly intelligent man, and I hand him this. He's
roll tape. You guys can just start at your leisure.
okay. Well, Dr. Morgan, I'm delighted that you're willing to participate in this little project, and I want to thank you ahead of time, not only for me and for Lori and for the students here at Florida State, but for students all over the country today and tomorrow that are going to treated to your contributions to the field and your story.
Dan, there's hardly anything that old men enjoy more than nostalgic reminiscing. So that's why you can get these fellas to spend so much time with you, I guess.
Well, I guess just to start, tell us a little bit about your journey, where you started and how you got here to Florida State.
Well, I'll shortcut that a little bit, I guess. I graduated in psychology, experimental psych, from Ohio State back in 1958, and went from there to my first appointment. And in those days, nobody worried about getting an appointment. All PhDs got jobs. I went to the University of New Mexico and was teaching as a young assistant professor on that faculty. And then I guess it was in 1961, I became aware of programmed instruction, which Skinner had introduced, and some people came to Albuquerque to establish the first company to produce programmed instructional materials. Jim Evans and Lloyd Homme, and they'd been working with Skinner at Harvard and with Bob Glazer at the University of Pittsburgh, and decided that there was some commercial value in programmed instruction. So they could do this anywhere they wanted to, so they picked a nice place and moved to the high desert country, and became very successful. And this was all, of course, in a small community like Albuquerque, visible to all of us. And I thought, well, if they could do that, I could. And so I called an old friend and former classmate, Bob Branson, who was on the faculty at Louisiana State University, and asked him if he would like to join me in creating a company to produce programmed educational materials. And as a reflection of his wisdom, he thought about it probably not more than a minute, and allowed us how he would like to do that, but we would have to finish up the semester at LSU and move to New Mexico. And he did. And in the meantime, I scrambled around and found some investment financing for the organization, and we created a PI company, and so that's really how I got into instructional development, from a fairly classical experimental psychologist who had been focusing on the problems of human learning. But then that chains on into a long, long story.
Okay, and then from the University of New Mexico, you left from there and went into business, is that right?
That's right. We formed a company and called General Program Teaching Corporation. I always thought that was kind of a dumb name, but it's the one that we had. And we were one of the, 50 or 60 odd little companies that were created around the United States. Teaching Machines Incorporated, the Evans Homme company, was the first one, and we were probably third or fourth in the nation. And then after that, within the next 2 years, a whole lot of companies sprung up from around the nation. And we all thought we were really going to revolutionize education, that we represented, if not a panacea for what was happening in American classrooms, at least a significant contributor to improvement in those processes. And I think it could have been. The critical part of that experience was one learning that the learning exercise could be very systematically ordered, and that you could identify learning outcomes against which you built instructional interventions, and that you could then empirically verify whether or not you were accomplishing what you set out to accomplish. And my training, with all three of my degrees in psychology, my training was very strongly on the empirical, pragmatic side. You could do anything if you could provide data that was evidence that you had in fact accomplished certain aims with respect to behavior change. And programmed instruction did a great many things, but perhaps the most important thing it did was to allow an empirical approach to the design of learning activities. And I think that was a very significant contribution, and one that has obviously endured. And that early experience led through a series of convolutions and side activities to what we call instructional systems development today. From the company became very successful, or relatively successful for a little company, under Branson's good management and my salesmanship. And so I had to resign from the university and work full-time in the company. And we did that for, 4 years or so. And I developed some realizations at that point. One, it became evident that programmed instruction, as we were developing it in the mid-60s, was not going to be very acceptable in a large scale to American classrooms. Teachers and administrators, for a variety of reasons, simply weren't adopting it. Everybody was trying it out, and it was highly visible and fairly dramatic. It got a great deal of publicity in non-educational periodicals like Time Magazine and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and so on. And I suspect by the mid-60s that virtually every school in the nation was experimenting or playing around with programmed instruction. But as a commercial enterprise, it was where you had to have very high volume sales, it was not making a dent in the textbook business, which we had thought it would do, but it wasn't. And so by 1963 and 4, it occurred to me that this really wasn't a viable business. And while it would take a while before it disappeared, it really wasn't going to be a major breakthrough. And during that process, I also began to learn something about schools. And I was not a professional educator by training. I had not come through a college of education, so I really didn't know how public schools operated. Things like teacher certification, textbook selection, and those things I was totally ignorant about them, which, by the way, you couldn't afford to be if you were looking at schools as a potential marketplace. So during the 4 years that Branson and I were in programmed instruction, we learned quite a bit about the way schools functioned and how these decisions, like textbook selections, are made. And one of the startling discoveries that I made, everybody else in the world evidently already knew, is that if you looked at educational expenditures in the public domain, that 95% of the money was spent on teachers and administrators and janitors, and that only 5% of the money was spent on everything else, which included debt retirement, and about 1.5% to 2% of the educational dollar was spent on educational materials. And materials were used for several years, and so that the acquisition costs were amortized over a several-year period. Because programmed instruction were essentially consumable items, and pound for pound were very expensive, and so schools clearly could not and would not make the expenditures necessary to provide those to large numbers of students. I also learned a lot about the criterion for which educational materials were selected. Part of it was political, part of it involved under the table payoffs, and a lot of it, the remaining criterion variables were, in my view, fairly irrelevant to the teaching learning process. Quality of the paper, hardback versus softback, the number of colors used in the printing, the weight and heft of the book, its potential durability, none of which address the teaching effectiveness of instructional materials, whether you're talking about textbooks or workbooks or educational films. They were selected on basically the table of contents and the appearance, attractiveness, and durability of books. Programmed instruction didn't stack up too well in that selection process. But at any rate, it occurred to me that the investments that were going to be required to really make a dent in the public educational processes were far larger than a little company could make. That I was still optimistic that changes could be made, and I was beginning to lean heavily toward strengthening the instructional materials side of the equation versus the almost total reliance on the people side of the equation. And I thought that, began to think that if you had enough funds, you could in fact develop materials which would accommodate and would be useful in the existing educational environment, and that you could in fact apply the systems principles that were essential to programmed instruction to the organization of a classroom with a live teacher, or the organization of an entire unit school, or a large group of schools, such as you might find in a school district. And so my idea of systems applications and systematic development of education then began to expand, to go beyond programmed instruction and unitized instructional materials to the entire process. And a fair number of other people in the country were beginning to think that same way as a consequence of this programmed instruction experience. Different people focused on different things. Some people, like Les Briggs, said if you can program the printed page, you can program an integrated mix of media. And he began to pursue that. Bob Mager obviously focused on the analysis and definition of objectives as something that was very important. And different people looked at different aspects of the learning environment and the learning process. My attention was drawn to the idea of altering the entire environment to optimize the conditions of learning. And this is sort of the direction that I took. And about that time, the Job Corps programs were beginning to open up, and a company on the West Coast, which is where I was living at the time, we had moved from Albuquerque to Palo Alto, our company. And so when I left General Program Teaching Corporation, I was invited to join Lytton Industry and to help them plan their entry into Job Corps training. And that was a fascinating experience, because suddenly we had as much control as you can have over an entire living learning environment for several thousand adolescent and post-adolescent young men, where you had an opportunity to influence the recreation, the housing, the residential component, the medical and physical component, and all of the academic and occupational learning parts of the environment. And so we were able to back off, and in the design of this, which we didn't have a lot of time for, but we were able to give it a fair amount of thought, we're able to design the to the degree that we were smart enough to do it, the entire environment so that you could take youngsters who were demonstrably unsuccessful in a public school environment, who had come to us, were in essentially an isolated 24-hour-a-day environment, both residential and schooling, and put together what you thought would be an educational program that was sufficiently powerful to bring those kids into adulthood. And that worked pretty well. I was really, looking back on it, really quite surprised how successful those programs were. We made some mistakes. There are things that we had to change. We entered some cul-de-sacs. But essentially, at least from my perspective, this is where instructional system design was born. This is where it was born for me, at any rate. And of course, Branson, after a brief interval, joined in that effort, and Roger Kaufman was involved with us, and our organization, Litton Industries, then began to expand beyond its Job Corps focus to applying these principles and tools to other kinds of learning environments.
From, how long were you at Litton?
About a little over 2 years.
2 years?
Mm-hmm.
And from Litton, you, if I'm not mistaken, you went to the Department of Education.
Well, you remember I said my motive in going to Litton was moving from a hungry little company that had very limited resources that it could invest in innovative instructional programs to a major U.S. corporation that had far greater resources. And of course, with government contracting, we did have a lot of money relative to what we had, and we're able to try out things that would have been very difficult to do without some considerable investment capital. On the other hand, as we did this, I began to realize that public education in the United States is a huge endeavor, perhaps the largest single endeavor in our society in terms of cost. And I began to realize that even a Litton Industries, with substantial government support, was not big enough to mount the kind of educational reform effort that by then I felt was necessary. And so I began to think about, well, where could you find very large amounts of money where you wouldn't be held terribly accountable for results? Because clearly, anytime you're in a trying out new things and you're trying experiments and breaking new ground, you can't be absolutely certain that you're going to have payoff for everything that you do. So I thought, well, where in the world could you find an organization or an entity that would put up those kinds of resources and give you that kind of freedom? And it occurred to me the U.S. government did that. And so I went from Litton to the U.S. Office of Education, joined the Bureau of Research there, and was in fact given monitorship, stewardship over fairly large amounts of money, and was tasked to undertake innovative development efforts that might lead to educational improvement. And people that I worked with in the Office of Education, Harold Howe, who was Commissioner of Education, Lou Bright, who was the Associate Commissioner for Education, and who had had the same kind of job in Westinghouse Learning that I had had in Litton Industry. So we were very compatible and mutually supportive. And we did mount what we hoped would be a national educational reform called Educational Systems for the 70s, at which we took an entire global systemic look at what was happening in a school district, a group of schools, and saying what could you manipulate and what could you change in those schools in order to maximize student learning, and what kinds of investments would you have to make in development of new programs, in changing the way teachers were trained, and indeed changing the roles of teachers, and in changing the managerial and administrative logistics of the school. Did you need to physically redesign classrooms, for example? Could you place a heavier reliance on carefully tailored and empirically validated instructional resources? Could you in fact individualize the instruction so that what was happening in the teaching learning process was optimally appropriate for each individual in the classroom, as opposed to fire hosing information out over all of them and hoping that they all got wet, and in fact, they don't. And that was terribly fascinating, and that went on for a little over 2 years, and that's when I met Bob Gagné. When I was in the Office of Education, he was a member of the USOE's National Curriculum Advisory Board, and the board was a group that I worked very closely with during this planning and developmental research process, and so I got to know him personally. As a matter of fact, I remember very well the first meeting of the board after I joined the office in Washington, D.C., and I knew he was on it, and I was looking forward to making his acquaintance because I admired him a great deal. I had first learned of Dr. Gagné when I was still a graduate student, and most of my training in graduate school was, as I said earlier, very empirical and fairly rigorous with respect to data-based knowledge development in psychology, and yet there were a lot of psychologists who weren't that way. They were much softer-headed in my view. About that time, a new introductory psych book came out, authored by Robert Gagné and a fellow named Edwin Fleshman. And I remember getting hold of that book and reading it, and the whole theme, the whole flavor of the book was empirical, and a very heavy focus on learning, human learning. And I thought, gee, this is fantastic. I really resonated to it, and became, without knowing him, a great admirer of Bob Gagné at that point. So when I finally met him, it was like finding a real mentor or soulmate, if you will. He and I resonated to one another, had the same biases or insights, if you will, and it was a delightful 2 years, and I might say he contributed enormously to the thinking on the ES70 project, which was being planned and put together at that point, and that was a very exciting time. I would rate that activity as one of my, I can't say accomplishments, but as one of the most interesting times that I had in my career. And building on the earlier experience in the Job Corps really helped my thinking develop and my approach to educational change mature. I say it wasn't an accomplishment because it was not a success. We did not, in fact, reform public schools, though there were a great many things that came out of that effort that have had enduring value. I don't think there's any question that the focus on more specification of learning outcomes and the operational definition of educational purposes was increased and enhanced by those years. And certainly the program got a fair amount of attention nationally, like programmed instruction had before. It wasn't too much before that we'd put the man on the moon, and or we're about to put the man on the moon, and the ES70 program was referred to sometimes in the press as education's moonshot. But politics, economics, Vietnam, all conspired to slow that program down and eventually cut it out. The program started under the administration of President Johnson, and was strongly supported by both the Congress and the White House at that point. And of course, with the Vietnam problems, Johnson left the presidency and a Republican administration came in. They had far less interest in pursuing educational reform, or in fact doing anything for public education. and the program began immediately to wind down and be closed off, as did the Job Corps programs under the Nixon administration. With some prescience, I anticipated that, and so shortly before the election, I was approached by Florida State to come here and assume the headship of the Department of Educational Research and work with them in expanding their embryonic program in educational system development, which was just getting started at that point. And they had done some planning on it, and they had 2 or 3 people that were sort of focusing on that here, one of whom was Professor Dick, Walt Dick, who was a youngster out of Penn State. And I was asked to come down and lead that program, and so I decided that would be a good time to make the change. Part of my motive for leaving the Office of Education, because I really left before the program was finished, though I had begun to have some pessimism about how far it might go. But one of my strong motives for coming to FSU from the federal government was that during the period that I was in the Office of Education, with fairly large amounts of money to spend. I think my annual budget, over which I essentially had discretionary spending authority, was in a neighborhood of $40 million a year for a couple of years, which in those days was a lot of money. And one of the things I discovered very early on is that I ran out of anybody to spend the money with. That the people who understood systemic approaches to educational development and the application of learning principles to the design of instructional materials and to arranging the variables and conditions of learning in the school were a very small number of people. Most people who were working in education at that time, and I think probably this is still true, focus on the processes of education. And if you do the job right, that's how you're evaluated, not in terms of whether or not you've changed the behavior in the learners for whom you're responsible. So there weren't many people who thought in this latter way. And as a consequence, it was hard to get people to think in terms of new ways of training teachers or new roles for teachers or different kinds of uses of integrated instructional materials or of changing the ways that schools are managed and administered. There were some. Some of those people had come through the Job Corps experience, people like Bob Mager. Some came by way of programmed instruction, Donald Toasty, Jim Evans, Lloyd Homme, Bob Branson, Roger Kaufman, Bob Gagne. But there weren't enough. There weren't enough people to mount the wide range of projects that we had envisioned and that we had funding to support. And I remember, sometime about a year and a half into this experience, becoming aware that I was running out of people with whom I could make federal grants and contracts. And on my blackboard in my office, I started writing down the names of all the people that I could think of. Now, what you have to remember is that at that time, 1965, 66, no one had been trained as an instructional system designer. All of the people that I have named and the others were people that got interested in educational change as a consequence of their experiences or where they were working. Colonel Gabriel Ofeisch, who was the founder of the International Society for Performance Instruction, was a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, involved in training in those days, and learned about programmed instruction, and began then to apply these ideas to the overall design of Air Force training. And I've mentioned the PI people. There were people that were working in the industrial sector. This is where Bob Mager was in those days. And so the approaches to planning and designing educational training programs, I think, took a giant step forward in the decade of the 60s. And And this was very useful. But again, the people who were working in that area had like Lou Bright, had developed their interests and their approaches and ideas in a non-public school environment. And as I say, there weren't very many and nobody was training them. The list that I had on my blackboard, I think I came up with about 30 names. Some of them I mentioned here. And for, I don't know, 3 or 4 months, I left that list on the board, and anytime I would have a visitor from somewhere from around the country coming into the Office of Education, mostly looking for funding, I would tell them what the list was about and ask them if they could add names, people I didn't know. I certainly didn't know everybody in the United States. And a few names were added in this way. I remember Sue Meyer-Markle's name was added at that time, and Les Briggs, who I had known and but hadn't put on my list, hadn't thought about him. I ended up with about 50 names in the entire United States, and these names had been contributed by quite a number of people who had had 1 or 2 when they came in. And I thought that's not enough people to mount a reform of national educational systems, and it occurred to me that nobody was training those people, that these people had all developed by virtue of experience or particular problems with which they had to deal, and that we really needed to get some graduate training programs going, turning out masters and PhDs in this specific area, rather than taking engineers or people trained in business or psychology and making them educational change agents. So I was mentally and temperamentally prepared to make the shift back to the university, from which I had been gone now about 10 years, to when Florida State came along and had the dean at that time, who was Stanley Marshall, had many of the same thoughts and ideas that I did. And so they invited me down and interviewed me for the position and offered me the chairmanship of the department, and I came, and then we put together the instructional systems program here at Florida State, building on what work they had already done. And that program was very, very well supported by the College of Education and by the university. It was fortuitous that within a couple of years after my arrival, Dr. Marshall left the Deanship of Education and became president of the university, and was in a position to provide even stronger support for it.
This, the program here is widely known as the best program in the world, instructional systems. And part the list of faculty reads like a who's who Hall of Fame. How would you, and you were instrumental in helping bring this program together, how do you build a world-class organization?
Well, it may be, Dan, a little easier to do when you're breaking new ground. If you wanted to build the best biology department in the world, it would take an enormous amount of money, and you would go out and hire known quantities in biology. Who are all the people who hold Nobel laureates in biology, and you'd build laboratories for them and pay them great salaries and attract them partly by virtue of the labs and salaries, and partly by the promise of the other people that you would bring in that were scattered and that they wanted to work with. If I were wanted to build the best department in computer science in the world, that's what I would do. Clearly that takes a lot of resources. And but the people that you would want to bring in are basically known quantities. You know who holds Nobel laureates. In the educational systems domain, and by the way, I use the term educational systems intentionally here because that was what we called it at first when we created this specialty, this degree specialty at Florida State. It was the ESD, or Educational System Development Specialty. And when I knew I was coming to FSU to be in this program, I had talked with the dean, and The program was mostly on paper at that point. Walt Dick, as I said, was here, and there were one or two others who were in the systems program, but it wasn't large, and certainly nobody was well known, and the department was not well known. School of Education at FSU was not well known at that point. As a matter of fact, you could say the whole university wasn't well known. I remember a quote that I heard not too long after I arrived here from the editor of the Miami Herald, who said the best kept secret in higher education in the United States is Florida State University. I think maybe in some ways that's still true. But at any rate, in talking with the dean, he asked me, he said, you know, if you really wanted to build the best program in the nation, who would you bring in to do it? And I thought, well, you would need people representing different specialties and subspecialties within the educational development domain. And you would want to bring in the best that you could attract in those domains, and count on a lot of synergy when you brought those minds and those people together. And we were fortunate in some respects. There wasn't a lot of competition. There were a lot of good people scattered around the country, but there were never more than a couple in one place. You know, they were at Berkeley, or they were at Michigan, or they were in private industry, but there was no critical mass anywhere. So it was my idea that it wouldn't take many people to really create a critical mass in the systems development area, and that we already had a small department and a quality department of educational research that this could be built on. And so when the dean asked me who would you bring in, well, I ticked off 4 or 5 names. The first was Bob Gagné. Now, Bob was a full professor at Berkeley in 1958 and 1968, I'm sorry. And Florida State University really had very few aspirations about hiring full professors from the University of California at Berkeley. And I remember the dean saying, "Do you know Professor Gagné?" And I said, "Yes, I do." He said, "Do you think he would come to FSU?" And I said, "Well, I don't know, but I would sure like to try to get him." And he said, "If you can get him, go get him." He said, "Who else?" Well, I named Leslie Briggs, who was head of the American Institutes of Research in the Stanford area at that time, and Bob Branson and Roger Kaufman, and a guy named Thorwald Espenson, who was the Associate Superintendent of Schools in Duluth, and I thought one of the most innovative public educators in the country at that time, and a few others. And he said, and now I hadn't yet moved to Tallahassee, I was still in Washington. He said, "If you can hire these people, bring them along." And so I can remember, the first person I called was Branson, and who was still with Litton Industries, running their Job Corps program, and described the charter that had been given at FSU, and said, "I think we can build a really super graduate program here in this field. Would you like to be a part of it?" And his answer was as quick as it was when we talked about forming the program instruction company. He said, "I sure would. It'll take me a little while to wrap up here, but I'd like to come with you." He said, "Who else are you going to bring in?" And I named the people. And he said, "Well, let me think about how we might work on that." And then I called Les Briggs, who I'd been working with in Washington. He was out on the West Coast, and I'd asked Les to do a number of things in this area and described to him what we were putting together. And Les's response was just about as quick. He said, "I'd love to join that group." And he said, "I can come this fall." And this was in the summer of '68. I hadn't come yet. And I offered the position to Thorwald Espenson, and he accepted the position. I talked to Roger Kaufman. He wasn't quite ready to move yet, but he said within a year or two, "I'd like to join you." He had some things he had going on, as I recall. And finally I called Bob Gagné, and he and I had become good friends at this point, and said, "Bob, shortly," I said, "I'm just accepted the chairmanship of the Department of Educational Research at FSU, and shortly you will be hearing rumors that you're going to be moving to FSU." And I said, I'm calling, and he laughed, and he said, I said, I'm calling not to elaborate on that, but to simply alert you to the fact that you will hear these rumors, and to suggest that perhaps you and Pat wouldn't want to buy any more property or anything in California, because the facts are you are going to be coming to Florida State. And he laughed and said, no, he said, I'm well along in years, and I'm established at Berkeley, and it's my intention to stay here. And he said, but thanks for thinking about me. I said, well, I don't accept that as a no. This was, I think, in about July. The American Psych Association, I believe it was American Psych Association meeting, was coming up in San Francisco in September. And I said, how about meeting with me at that meeting, and let me tell you about what we're planning on doing. And he said, sure, love to talk to you about it. So I then called Branson and told Branson about this. Branson's out on the West Coast in the Bay Area where Dr. Gagne was. And I called Bob Mager and told him about it. And I said, I'd like you guys to get together socially with Gagne and talk about what's happening at FSU and how exciting it is going to be, and how anybody would be a fool not to join that group who cares anything about educational development. Well, they did that. And then Bob Branson and I met with Gagne in a hotel room, and we talked through the plans at FSU and the other people who were coming, and the support that the university was providing for the development of this new academic program, and really began to twist Gagne's arm to join us. And he was very polite and cordial, but said no. He really liked it where it was, and that he and his wife had property on the Russian River, and really didn't want to move. And we kept talking, and he obviously his interest was very whetted by all this, but he still didn't feel like he wanted to make a change. And Branson was the guy that really tipped it. He finally said, you know, Bob, he said, wherever you go to a meeting, you can't add to your prestige now. You make a high salary. He said, those things wouldn't change if you came to Florida State, but Florida State wouldn't add anything to those. He said, on the other hand, out at Berkeley, when you have an idea, or when you have a problem, or when you get into a new piece of research, he said, at Berkeley, who do you talk to about it? He said, who's really interested at Berkeley in the things that are of intense interest to you? And Gagne thought about it, and you can see his mind just move across the bay. And he said, you know, you're right. And then Bob went on to say, at Florida State, all of the people you would be working with are interested in the same kinds of things that you are. And you'd have people to talk to. And you'd have people that would be stimulating for you. And at that point, Bob said, well, he said, I'll talk it over with my wife, Pat, and I'll get back to you. He said, but I really don't think we'll do it. So he went home, and about a week later, he called and said, you know, would you all pay me the same salary I get at Berkeley? And we agreed that we'd certainly do that. And he agreed to come. And so he came the next spring, I think, certainly within the year. And Gagne came, and Briggs came, and Tori Espenson came, and then a little while later, Roger Kaufman came. And we had instant visibility for the program around the country. When you move people like Leslie Briggs and Bob Gagne from AIR and Berkeley to a place nobody ever heard of in Tallahassee, in the profession and in the field, it got a lot of attention. People were curious as to why they had moved and wondered what was going on at Florida State University. Then we began to hire and think about hiring younger people to bring in. And that's when we began to talk to people like Bob Reeser, a little later Marcy Driscoll, and John Keller from Syracuse, and built up, and Walt Wager from Indiana, and began to build up a a cadre of people whose specialties complemented one another, Branson was, I think, one of the best managers of research and development projects in the nation, and an applied learning man without peer. Roger Kaufman, of course, well known for his work in front-end analysis and systems work. Gagné was probably the best person, probably the top educational researcher in the world, and someone who could bridge learning theory and the applications in training and education. Briggs, in my view, was the leading person in the development of selection and development of instructional media, and I was the chairman of the board. So I didn't have any specialty, but it was a good group, and we began to attract graduate students, began to attract external funding, and went on from there. So that's how it grew.
Talk about some of your mentors when you were growing up.
Well, that's I think that's a tough question for me to answer, because as a young PhD and a graduate student before that, God, I had mentors who were classmates. Bob Branson was one of these. Hal Fletcher was one. People that got me through graduate school. People a lot smarter than I was. I think, as I ponder that question, there have been an enormous number of people that have influenced my thinking and my career. One that is not certainly well known in our field, and who's not in our field, as a matter of fact, was an experimental psychologist by the name of Clint Pereboom, who I first met. He was a young PhD out of UCLA who came to Oklahoma State and was one of my teachers. And Branson also had classes with Dr. Pereboom. And I mention him because I think probably he's the one that absolutely conditioned me to the core in a belief of an empirical approach to research and to studying the problems of human learning. He was an enormously demanding, somewhat obnoxious professor. I think very bright, but when he taught a course, and I took several courses from him, as did Bob Branson, when he taught a course, he didn't expect you to get some of it, or most of it. He expected you to get every bit of it. And he worked through his objectives carefully for whether the course was a course in experimental psych or human learning or the history of psychology, all of which courses I took from him. He would develop the objective, usually had 3 or 4 textbooks, and he lectured on things that were not in the textbooks and expected you on the examinations and at the end of the term to know every bit of it. It was my first experience with Criterion referenced examinations, where the standard wasn't 90-90, it was 100-0. You knew it all. And he didn't accept much less than that. And I had never had a classroom teacher like that, one who placed those kind of demands on you. As a matter of fact, I didn't think I could meet those demands, but I found out that if you kill yourself and let everything else go, you can, in fact. He had a great deal of influence on me. I don't even know where Dr. Pereboom is today. Last I heard, he was on the faculty at LSU. It's interesting, side note, is that a couple of years later, there were 3 of us in a graduate class at Ohio State where we were asked to describe, we were trying to find the factors or variables that distinguish between the best professor and the worst professor in order to develop professor rating scales. This was really a course in measurement. And one of the tasks we had was to describe in detail, not an abstract professor or not a combination of professors, but think of the very best professor you ever had and then describe in detail that person's characteristics and behavior. And so we did that, and after the class, The three of us from Oklahoma State, it just happened to be visiting about it. This was Bob Branson, another chap, and myself. And we'd all described the same guy. You know, of all the teachers that we had had in our experience, we all described this Professor Paraboom. Said, I've never told him that. I probably ought to one of these days. But at any rate, that's someone that had a profound influence on me. Bob Gagné, of course, I've already mentioned his influence on me. A Korean scholar by the name of Bum-mo Chung, Dr. Chung, University of Chicago, PhD. I met him when I began to do work in Korea. And his research, he was a student of Ben Bloom's, and his research and work had a big impact on me. He was one of the first people that I knew that really began to apply some of these ideas to the human learning processes. And through him, I got to know Ben Bloom. And Bloom was another person that influenced my thinking and my approach to education. Who else? I made some notes here. Oh, one that I have to mention is a guy named Bascom Story. And I met Dr. Story when I went with Litton Industries. He was my boss in Litton Industries. And was a fairly traditional educator. Had been associate superintendent of schools for the state of Texas. Had been dean of education at Memphis State University, dean of graduate school at the University of Tennessee, and director of training for the Peace Corps. And when Litton Industries formed its educational companies, he was brought in to head those up, and I reported to him. Later I replaced him in Litton, and he went back to the government. But here was a very traditional educator, several years older than I was, who had grown up with classic professional education, unlike myself. And yet he was very responsive to the ideas of an empirical approach or systems approach to educational development. And he knew an enormous amount about the way schools are run and the politics and ethos and ethics and culture of public education, both nationally and internationally. And he really became kind of a tutor for me for quite a while. He was the one responsible for, he went from Litton back to the Agency for International Development and ended up as the chief technical advisor for AID in Korea. And he was the one responsible for the Korean Educational Development Project and inviting me and Florida State University to come undertake that work with the Koreans. So he had a lasting impact, and is still having. He's still alive, and we meet from time to time. And he usually prefaces most of our conversations by saying, "Morgan, let me tell you what you ought to do." And then about 90% of the time, what he tells me is really what I ought to do, and I sometimes do it. I've mentioned Branson. We were undergraduates together and graduate students, and we've worked together all these years. Certainly, he's had a major impact on me. But I could go on, Dan, and list many, many other people. And you know, you're a fool if you don't listen to and observe people who are smarter than you are, who have different experiences, and to try to steal from them. Use their ideas and use their approaches. And you're going to learn a lot from your own mistakes. You can also learn a lot from other people's mistakes. So certainly my work has been the product of a great many people.
Tell us a little bit, you mentioned the program, the educational program in Korea. Tell us a little bit about how that started and what it is and the impact that it's had.
Well, that can be, that was an almost 10-year effort, and that can be a very long story. Let me see if I can just hit some of the high spots on it, because I think probably it was the most significant activity that I've ever been involved with. It was certainly the most successful. Most of our adventures in education improvement, school reform have come to naught or had only marginal impact. In Korea, at least for quite a long time, it had a very major impact on the way they run their school. I guess it must have been in 1968, 69, about the time I came to Florida State. Dr. Story, as I've mentioned, was the chief technical and education advisor to the American Embassy and AID in Korea. Korea was just beginning its economic upturn. From 1950, when the Korean War ended, there was gradual recovery and the development and rebuilding of the social and economic infrastructures in Korea. And it was a country that the people had sacrificed a great deal, maintained very low standards of living in order to develop the developmental capital to move into a manufacturing and industrial economy. Korea had almost no natural, South Korea had almost no natural resources. The mountainous country, they weren't even barely self-sustaining in agriculture, had very little industry, and this is a country that recognized that its only natural resource really was its 30 million people. And if they could educate and train those people and create a different kind of economic base where they were essentially processing raw materials and exporting products, that they could move into the 20th century along with other developed nations. It was clearly a very undeveloped nation at that point. And the prime minister, president, and a deputy prime minister of that era realized that in order to accomplish that, they needed to make major changes in their national educational program. It was basically an agrarian economy, and they were talking about moving into a high-tech manufacturing economy, and it required that many more of their population be educated, and to be educated in a different way. Most of their education at that point was very classic academic kind of preparation. So the prime minister approached the American ambassador about getting some American support to look at their educational program. In fact, they were particularly interested in expanding education through television. They were aware of what was happening in America Samoa at that time, where television was being used to augment classroom instruction and to actually replace teachers or to provide for teachers that weren't there. And they asked about it, and the ambassador, after this meeting with the prime minister, approached Dr. Story and said, is this something that America can help with? That we have expertise in educational television that might be useful to them? Well, Story had just come through the systems orienting experience that he and I had had with Litton Industries, and said, well, we could do that. He said, but probably what they ought to do is really take a systems analytic look at their national educational program as it exists, and the socio and economic needs of the country, and to determine the gaps between what they have and what they ought to have or what they need to have, and see what then they should do in the way of changing or adding to their educational interventions. He said it may well be that a national educational television program would be appropriate, but it may well be that there are other things, either instead of or in addition to that, that they could do to get the most in a return on their investment. And so the ambassador charged him to get with the Koreans and see if this couldn't be worked out. And he met with the Ministry of Education people and then flew back to Washington from Seoul and called a meeting of about half a dozen of us from around the country. Chap from the Stanford Research Institute, 2 or 3 people from AID in Washington, myself, and it seemed like a couple of other people. And they convened us for 3 or 4 rainy days in Washington, locked us away, and he described the problems in Korea. Here's a country that is on the verge of economic takeoff. Their economic development is going to be seriously constrained by the manpower base that they have, unless they move immediately to change that manpower base. And talked about how one might go about it. And in the course of the conversation, it was agreed among us that we really needed, or they really needed, to mount a very careful analysis of their education and human resources sector. How are the resources presently deployed? What are the limitations on the availability of those resources? And what is being accomplished educationally with those resources? Now, could they add to them, or could they use them differently in order to make those accomplishments more nearly congruent with what they needed in terms of their economic growth ambitions? And a consequence of that was that it was decided to undertake a systems analysis of the EHR, the Education and Human Resources sector of the Korean society. And FSU was invited to lead that sector assessment. We call it a systems analysis. Later on, that same comprehensive analytic approach came to be called sector assessments. But at any rate, we did that. We put together an interdisciplinary team, and in the summer of 1970, took that team, which included specialists in educational administration and management, in manpower projections and development, in manpower economics, in microeconomics, instructional design and technology, teacher training, and so on. I think there were 5 or 6 people on the team, most of whom wore more than one hat, so that you had probably, among those 6 people, you had 8 or 9 subspecialties relevant to the educational processes that were addressed, or you had competence there to address them. Team went to Korea. A lot of advanced work had been done because there were a few months' notice in gathering information and data and identifying data sources, and the team went and conducted this system study. Spent the entire summer doing that, mostly in gathering data. Then came back to Tallahassee, brought some of our Korean counterparts along, including Dr. Chung that I mentioned earlier, and began then to sort out what kinds of things might be done in the educational program to accomplish the aims that Korea had. We ended up with a set of recommendations. By the end of 1970 and by January of 1971, an analytical report and recommendations had been developed and were forwarded to the Korean government. Our first thought was that we might provide an array of alternative options. That is, you could do A, or you could do B, or you could do C, and if you did these different things, this is what you'd get if you took one approach, this is what you'd get if you got another. As we got into it, the team and the consultants and our Korean colleagues finally realized that there was a best approach, and that was really a total systems restructuring, and that there really was no alternative subset of that was worth undertaking. That if you weren't going to go whole hog, don't bother. And I think most of us were not very optimistic that the Korean government would undertake the kind of reform that we had proposed, because by public education standards, it was a fairly drastic reform. We were talking about changing roles of teachers. We were talking about totally instructionally designing the curriculum, the entire curriculum. We were focusing, by the way, on the elementary and middle school part of the program, because this appeared to be the level of education and training that they needed to provide in terms of their urgent manpower requirements. It was going to require a major investment in the development of instructional materials and resources, because we were proposing a shift in the balance of gravity, if you will, from total dependence on a classroom teacher to using the classroom teacher in a different way and a much larger dependence on the development of empirically built instructional resources. We did have television included as an integral part of the instructional package, and radio. These recommendations were given to the Korean government, and if you ask me what were the most significant part, there were many, many different variables that were addressed in these recommendations. But I think the sine qua non of the whole program, the part that was indispensable, was the instructional systems design approach to the development specifications of the curriculum and to the development of both the teacher and the materials-based instructional programs. And to my astonishment, I was invited to Korea to formally present this to the Korean government, the Ministry of Education. And to my astonishment, they decided almost immediately to undertake the program. You have to recognize that their response was one almost of desperation. They saw no alternative to developing the manpower resources that they knew they were going to require. Interestingly enough, in 1970, they didn't know exactly what businesses they were going into. They just knew they were going into businesses, that they were going to shift from an agricultural economy to a manufacturing and high-tech economy. In 1970, by the way, Dan, the biggest foreign exports that Korea had were in wigs and plywood. And they got the raw material from the plywood out of Malaysia and the Philippines, and they processed it, developed plywood, and sold it all over the world. They got the hair for the wigs out of China and Southeast Asia and processed it and sold wigs. And they were among the world's biggest exporters of those two things, and those were their biggest exports. Now in 1998, when you look at the exports that Korea has today, it's hard to imagine that plywood and wigs were ever a very significant part of their export base. But as I say, they didn't know what they were going into. They didn't produce television, they didn't produce cars, they had virtually no electronic production in those days, but they knew they were going to get ready to do it and knew that they had to have trainable people in order to do that. So I'll go back to what I said a moment ago. Their decision to undertake this was really one of desperation. They had no alternative. And as a consequence, the government supported this reform effort to the hilt. They created a National Institute of Educational Development called the Korean Educational Development Institute. They assigned some of their best and brightest people in a nation to the leadership of that. The first president was Dr. Young-Duk Lee, who was one of the brilliant young professors of education at Seoul National University, which is their Harvard. And for 8 years, he was the head of that program. In order to support the program, they kept the Minister of Education in place for, I think, 6 or 7 years. The average life of a Minister of Education had been about 14 months in the years preceding that, and it's a reflection of the government's the value that they placed on this program, the importance they placed on it, the fact they didn't change the minister, and they didn't change the president of the Korean Educational Development Institute. The institute was built, developed, within 3 or 4 years was 500 people, many of whom had been trained at universities all over the world to the master's and graduate level in a wide variety of areas. Many were trained here at Florida State. Instructional systems, technology, systems analysis, curriculum development, educational evaluation, educational administration and management, and a cadre of very currently trained and very powerful people were assembled, and they undertook the development of this. FSU continued to have an advisory role, sort of as needed advice when they needed it. We were in and out of there on a continuing basis. We trained quite a few people in Korea in short-term training. We trained a very large number of people here for non-degree training, master's training, and longer-term investment in doctoral programs. Somebody told me a few years ago that FSU had trained more PhDs in Korea, or of Koreans, than any other university in the country, and I wouldn't be surprised at that. Interestingly enough, to give you an idea of the caliber of people that were involved, this Dr. Lee, young Dr. Lee, who was the president for these first several years of KETI, ultimately became prime minister of the country. And several of the people who were involved moved into very significant leadership roles, Minister of Education, presidents of universities, and they're still in those leadership roles, even though they're aging somewhat by now. But at any rate, they undertook it. It took them 8 years to build it. When they got through, they had a program that was demonstrably superior to their conventional educational program. Through the years, I began to realize that despite the primitive appearance of their national educational program, in terms of student achievement, it was probably superior to ours. We spent a lot more money on our national education. Our schools cost more, our teachers were paid more, we had a lot richer resources available to the students. But we were not taking really the systemic application of ideas and organizing schooling in that respect. We still don't. They did. And so with less money per student, they were able to accomplish far more in the way of student achievement. They demonstrated that toward the end of the development period by controlled experimental comparisons. Kids trained in the conventional schools and kids educated, 250,000 of them in the new instructionally designed programs, teaching essentially to the same national objectives. And there was a 20 to 25% differential overall, and in no grade or subject area did the instructionally designed curriculum learners fail to exceed the conventional learners. Then, of course, only a few years later, the international comparative studies came along, the International Educational Evaluation Program, where they compared middle school leavers in a variety of countries on math and science, which are two areas that you can collect comparative data on, and found that the Koreans were usually number one in the world and never worse than number two. So those programs, I think, were very successful. Now, a lot of years have passed. I've asked the question of Korean colleagues, how much of what you built in the decade of the 70s is still around? Well, they've gone through several generations of curriculum development and textbook evolution, but they say the basic instructional design principles have been followed. I can't know that for sure, but they tell me. They may tell me that to make me feel good, I'm not certain. But that was a very successful effort and impacted a lot of other things. We have, our people in Washington, the Department of Education people have been thoroughly briefed on this program, have viewed it with envy, have marveled that it's a shame we can't undertake such a program in this country, have related the success of it to the fact that you had a totalitarian dictatorship in Korea at the time it was undertaken. I suspect it could still be done in this country with the right commitment and leadership, and perhaps will be someday.
How has your work and involvement with other countries changed or impacted your thinking?
Well, personally, I've been involved in international education development almost since the Korean time. In fact, that really was my first foray into international education development. And one of the things that I concluded from that I've already mentioned, and that is that some of the developing countries, their conditions are so desperate and their needs are so urgent that they'll be willing to try out things that the modern developed states will not try out. That is, we're reasonably comfortable with our failures. and they can't afford to be. The Ghanas and the Botswanas and the Chiles and the Indonesias of the world, their populations, their inability to provide a quality educational opportunity for thousands or millions of their children creates a need, a very, as Roger would say, a need that must be met. There's a large gap in there. And so they'll try different things. And that's been true. Now, we've worked over the last 30 years probably with 45 or 50 countries around the world. None has undertaken a reform of the scope or magnitude of Korea. On the other hand, many of those efforts have been informed by the Korean experience. And often parts of what was done in Korea or approaches that were taken in Korea have been applied or tried out elsewhere. Several countries in Latin America with which we've worked, certainly in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, we now have a secondary education reform project going on. Botswana, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Somalia, quite a number of other places where they've tried different parts of it. It's interesting, quite a number of those places have created a National Educational Institute patterned after the one in Korea, and have consolidated research and development efforts and instructional materials development responsibilities in a single place. And I think there's been real payoff for that. Nobody has taken a 10-year systematic developmental reform effort like the Koreans have experienced. But I think there's no question in my mind, Dan, that this work has impacted the lives of literally millions of youngsters throughout the world. That there are people alive today who would not be had it not been for these educational development efforts on the part of their countries. And certainly the condition of living has improved some. But population grows faster than resources in many of the developing countries. And so while improvements have been made, in many cases the absolute gains are not gains, they're losses. A great deal more needs to be done.
You know, during your career, you've traveled all over the world, seen lots of things. Surely there are some interesting stories that you have about our field.
Probably none that would merit telling on television. Most of the stories that quickly come to mind relate to my own physical discomfort in some of these countries, and I don't think that's really worth our spending much time on. Showers that don't work, toilets that don't flush, and the food that you can't eat. I think not a story as such, but the thing that comes to my mind is the dedication of people, the intense interest of government leaders, many government leaders, and parents in improving their children's education. I've been out in villages in Liberia, really in the back country, where some of the villagers and the village head had probably never been more than 5 miles from their village. And yet they understand, even though they don't read and write, and they don't see television, they understand that the world has changed and that they need to provide a different kind of educational opportunity for their kids. One of the things we learned in working particularly in Africa, that is even 3 years of education can make a marked effect in the life of a person forever, that is for their entire lives. That agricultural productivity goes up, interest in continuing education of their own children changes enormously. So that even 3 years of public schooling, public or private, can have a lifelong impact on a person's well-being and on their subsequent condition of living. And that everybody, however primitive the conditions may appear to a Westerner, there is a universal motive for improving education. And I think this is really heartening. You ask an interesting story. I remember visiting a village chief in Liberia, and I was taken there by his son. And this guy had about 8 wives. He was in typical garbs, a very poor village, by my lights, prosperous by theirs. And this man clearly owned the village. He was the chief. Now his son, the one who had took me there, was the Minister of Information in the capital of Monrovia, and had a PhD in communications from the University of Michigan. One generation, he'd authored a couple of textbooks. He's an international figure. In one generation, he went from an environment where you have a totally illiterate but not stupid father, well, maybe not too bright, he had 8 wives, and into the 20th century, 21st century practically. I'll never forget standing there with this guy in the village, treating his father with such great respect, his father sitting on a blanket in the dirt outside his hut, and our cars waiting off in a distance. I thought, gee, education can make a hell of a difference. And it does. I guess the one other story that I would tell, and I don't want to be maudlin, is work that we were doing in Colombia, South America, and again in rural villages, in which our task was to evaluate a non-formal adult village education program for campesinos, Colombian farm peasants. And the program had put together reading programs for adults. And I can remember going into, again, a hutment where people were receiving education, and this little old Colombian woman who looked to be about 80, I don't know how old she was, but she looked quite old, was reading in Spanish, and turned to me as I was taken over to where she was, and she looked up very proudly, and she could read, and she could read the Bible. And this is a consequence of education. In this case, it was non-formal education organized by a Catholic priest for rural villagers. But it was changing lives. In this evaluation, we found out that a little bit of education can make a very large impact on what happens to people and what happens to their children. Changes a great many things.
As professionals in our field today, how can we improve education?
Well, one of the things that I've said to my students is you got to do it on purpose, that it doesn't happen by accident. And we have tried to stimulate our graduates who come out of here to go out as missionaries to change education, to improve it. You have to start out with recognizing certain things. One is that education is not controlled by a bunch of theys. The facts are there are individuals that live and breathe and have names that are the gatekeepers for educational change. You know, it might be a commissioner of education, might be a superintendent of schools, might be a key legislator or governor, or an innovative classroom teacher. Those are all people. And if you can identify as a change agent who these people are and work with them, and then begin to orchestrate resources to be brought to bear on an educational change effort, I think you can change education. I kind of despair for what's happening in the United States because, as I said earlier, our condition is not sufficiently desperate. I think it is sufficiently desperate. I simply think that we don't perceive its desperation to really mount the kind of jarring restructuring effort that is required. You know, you hear criticism of public education all the time, and I suspect public education merits a lot of that criticism. Also, on the other hand, it does a pretty good job. But the percentage of people who are failing to benefit optimally from the public educational experience is, in my opinion, going up every year. And that we are creating a greater disparity between the have-nots of our society and the haves. The people from middle-class, mainstream homes are living lives of considerable affluence. They're comfortable, they have challenging jobs, they raise healthy and well-adjusted children. There is a very large percentage of our society, and a growing percentage, for whom that dream is simply not a reality. And I believe the only way that it can become a reality is through a better, more effective public educational system. I don't think we deal with that problem through charter schools or through vouchers for private schools or anything else. I think we must solve the problem at its foundation, and that is in the public schools. And I think that I think public schools need to be like airplanes. Everyone flies every time. And you occasionally have a crash, but you're not tolerant of crashes. And we're very tolerant of unsatisfactory and mediocre schools. I don't think we need to be. I don't think we should be. And you hear about, you know, George Bush said, "I'm the education president," and you hear governors sometimes say that. Very few top national leaders at state or federal level have really undertaken the initiative and placed as a priority the improvement of education that I think the country demands today and that we desperately need. And the signals of a failing educational system are so numerous and manifest. The shrinking percentage of people who vote, the increased numbers of people who are on transfer payments, the fact that we're having to build prisons faster than we're building schools, all in my view are symptomatic of an inadequate educational program. And we spend a lot of money on education. I would argue that we probably need to spend more, but we need to spend it differently and a lot smarter than we're now doing. I think that people trained with the tools of instructional design, or as we said earlier, educational design, probably have a key role to play in the reform of schools. The empirical approaches, the systematic approaches, the trying different things and discarding those which don't work, and doing that until you find those which do. And you find things that work with particular subsets of the population, so that we don't have a one-size-fits-all approach to education. Frankly, I think that this new and very popular school of educational development that is coming along called constructivism is antithetical to that approach. I think that the only way you can succeed is if you look at data. You try different things. No one has the wisdom to know for sure what's going to work all the time with particular segments of the population. So you have to think, wisely plan, and try different interventions, and try those in lots of different combinations until you find the things that will work. Any human organism can learn. I've already said that most parents and support group people want children to learn. They want to support it if they know how, if they can be helped, and if they see some payoff, if they see some success. And one of these days, you guys, people coming along, not the Bransons, the Morgans, and the Gagnes, but the next generations will perhaps find the answer to that. We found that answer in Korea, but there was a very unusual set of circumstances. And I would not suggest that what was done in Korea in terms of the educational process and products would necessarily be appropriate for everywhere else or indeed anywhere else. But the approaches, the analytic approaches to determining the need, determining the array of resources potentially available, and the way of organizing those resources, and planning it, and doing it, and then revising the use and array of resources as a function of learner achievement could be done anywhere. Could be done anywhere, and indeed probably must be done anywhere where educational change of any consequence is going to occur.
You'll elaborate on, you've suggested that as an instructional designer we need to have a mindset of a change agent. Would you elaborate on that, what that means?
Well, not everybody agrees with me on that. I've argued that we ought to focus more on keeping our people in public school environments and less from Arthur Andersen and AT&T. Without much success, I might say. It's hard for public schools to compete with those places in a lot of ways. I think that it's incumbent on the faculty of this department, again, I speak just for myself, to really attempt to make students who come through our programs aware of the needs for change in education, the needs for improvement, aware of their unique qualifications to contribute to that change, and to imbue in these people that pass our way a sense of obligation or responsibility to spend at least a portion of their professional career, to dedicate a part of their lives to making those changes occur. I don't believe anybody else can or will do it. Now that sounds like some kind of a missionary ideology, and I suppose maybe it is, and I don't want to sound hokey or corny about it. I think that's on the social responsibility side. On the very selfish, what's in it for me side, I can't imagine anything that's more fun than the exercise of that kind of power. When you start talking about changing basic educational systems of communities and nations, talking about changing those environments in the long term, and not necessarily the long term, and in the short term. And if you have the tools and resources and wisdom and creativity to do that, I can't think of any more exhilarating experience. So this isn't a question of asking people to go out and do good in the world. This is a question of making people aware, is that, man, you can have a very self-fulfilling ball and get paid pretty well for it, and probably have a chance for making a fairly significant impact on the world you live in and the world your children and grandchildren are going to live in. That probably sounds kind of corny. But what I've done, I haven't done out of any particular noble motives. I have just found this an enormously exciting set of challenges to respond to. And I started this back in my program instruction days when I realized that I could do any of a variety of things, and that I wasn't economically pressed, and that I could really do with my time, my life, what I wanted to do. What would I do for fun if I didn't have to work for a living? And for the last 40 years, what I have done has been for fun. I needed to work for a living too, but they happen to coincide. And I think that bright people that are interested in the real ultimate challenges of the world will find the change of society the ultimate challenge. You can't think of anything that is more fun or gives you a greater power trip. And I think I'll stop with that.
What advice do you have for graduate students? Here's a graduate student just getting ready to walk in the door, champion to start their career in our field, what advice would you give?
You mean they're exiting the program or entering the
Getting
program?
ready to start.
Hmm?
They're getting ready to enter the program.
Enter the program.
Right.
Well, I guess there are 3 or 4 things I say to my students, the ones that come to me for advice, and things that I say in my own classes. One is that one of the first pieces of advice is an outgrowth of my own experience as a graduate student, and that is get to know your fellow graduate students who come from all over the place and bring all kinds of different experiences and different perceptions of the world, and get to know and work with those people on a close personal basis, because you can learn more from your fellow graduate students than you can from the faculty or sitting in classrooms. That was certainly my experience in the years that I spent in graduate school, learning from people like Hal Fletcher and Bob Branson and many more that I could name. And it's one that I pass on to students here. I think most follow that. I'm not talking about just group project work. I mean really getting together in some purposeful bull sessions from time to time. The other is get to know all the faculty. You said we were the #1 program in the country. I think we probably are, but it's a little hard to empirically demonstrate that, and I've already talked about the importance of empirical data. Certainly we're one of the better programs in the country, and yet we're still small. You know, we're talking about a dozen faculty members, more or less, and visitors that we have in, like Professor Ely and Russell and others, take advantage of those people. Go in and see them, impose on them, make appointments, go in and question them and press them and get them to react to your ideas. I think that's important. There are a lot of things available here, and some of those are handed out in classes. Many of the things available aren't handed out in classes. They're available through internships or moving yourself around on different kind of research assistantships. A lot of different projects are going on. And most of those will, pay graduate students to be involved in them. I advise my students, don't get too comfortable with one. Spend a term on this one and work closely, or as closely as you can, with what Roger Kaufman is doing. Next term, get over and spend time with Dr. Dick. See if you can't work on one of his projects, or Dr. Reeser. And I really encourage the students that I personally advise to do those kinds of things through internship or assistantships. Then read the field. There's a hell of a lot more to read today than there was 30 years ago. And it's easy to sort of confine yourself to those things that you're required to read in classes. And yet there's a wealth of literature that's available outside, some of which is kind of old now, but it's still worthwhile. I think everybody ought to read Gagnier's book. I've forgotten the title of it, on his 50 years in research, where he goes from basic learning research to some model development and theoretical advances, and finally applications kind of research to the learning process. It's a fairly tedious reading, at least the early parts of it are, but you'd be changed by that. That would add to your apperceptive mass in remarkable ways. Those are the things I would advise students. We're not talking about rocket science. This program's not all that hard to get through. And a student has, with a little organization of time, can have a fair amount of discretionary time. And that discretionary time can be spent kind of in the ways that I've talked about to really maximize the tools that you leave Florida State with.
Tell us about the process that you use in writing articles, doing research, writing books.
Well, I wouldn't be a good model at all on that. I have only written 2 or 3 articles in the last 40 years that I wasn't invited to write. I have only submitted 1 article, unsolicited, for publication. And I don't know how many articles I have. You could look at my resume. It's not a huge number, but it's, I suppose, respectable for a career. Somebody would hear a paper that I gave, or I was involved in some activity, and some journal editor would say, would you give us a paper on that? And I would do it. I have not had a great deal of interest in publishing. I've always felt guilty about not publishing enough, not guilty enough to cause me to do more. But I think it's important. It's important because if you have anything to say, then you really ought to share it. I think that it's difficult sometimes to get the most important things said because of the strictures of and the value that we put on publishing in referee journals. And referee journals very often, and you know, we publish one here in the Learning Systems Institute, the Performance Improvement Quarterly. But the facts are referee journals tend to want to maintain an aura of respectability and scientific rigor, and therefore research papers have to meet certain fairly standard design criteria before they merit publication in these journals. And yet a lot of what people think and do and experiences that they have are not controlled experimental group things, not even qualitative research things, but are worth someone writing about and sharing with their colleagues. If you think about the Korean experience I've described, that doesn't lend itself to a neat article for ETRD or PIQ. And yet that's something that people in the field should know about. You know, one of the few times we've done full bore what we talk about doing and see some payoff for it. And so I don't think that I'm a good model for publications. I don't particularly like to write things. I've published what I had to, what I felt I really owed the profession, and not much else. I have never written an article just in order to get a publication. That's not necessarily good advice for the young professional coming along, by the way. I have been tenured for 100 years, so I haven't had to worry about that sort of thing.
You alluded earlier to a fact that's really becoming quite a controversy in our field, and that is the instructional designers. Are we really involved in education? Are we involved in business? And there seems to be some debate as to whether our school or schools across the country in instructional systems should be housed in colleges of education, or should we be housed in colleges of businesses? What are your thoughts on it?
Well, if you look at what is, as opposed to what I might think should be, through the years we have become highly applied. The corporations, private sector, military, government agencies are very, very responsive to the kinds of things that we do in our profession. You know, they're interested in training people, changing behavior, doing it quickly and economically, efficiently, and certainly instructional systems design makes direct contributions to that. The private sector, the government agencies are not interested in the ritual or in the processes of education. They don't have turf to protect. They want to change behavior of their workers or their personnel or their agents or whatever, and they want to do it in the most efficient way. ISD really lends itself to that, and that's the reason I suspect that the vast majority of our graduates over the past 30 years have gone into the private sector or into government agencies. Few have gone into universities. Hardly any have gone into public schools. So we're responsive to Skinner's rules of reinforcement. We engage in and perseverate in those behaviors which are reinforced. And applied learning development is highly reinforced working with public schools and with public educators is not only not positively reinforced, quite often punished. And so we have learned to avoid those and go where the salaries are higher and where our work is appreciated. And so in that respect, it might make sense for us to shift to schools of business or to schools of communication. Florida State has provided a relatively hospitable academic environment for our department and our program over the past 30 years. On the other hand, I know that there are more traditional, some traditional educational people, even here at Florida State, that kind of wonder what we're doing in the college. They regard us as sort of a bunch of privileged characters for a variety of reasons. But I guess I'm glad we're in the College of Education. I hope we stay there for a while. I think these programs should be. The pendulum for educational change swings back and forth, and I suspect it's about time for it to swing back to why can't we save the schools, and maybe at that time there'll be more attention to and opportunities for our graduate in school research and school learning. But I think we've been well treated here at FSU.
What are your predictions for the future of instruction systems?
Well, I think I often ask that on doctoral exams and get some really strange predictions sometimes, none of which I remember right now. But I think that if we don't get all hung up on model development, where we begin to focus on the processes of our discipline rather than the purpose and outcomes of the application of our tools, I think we'll be in good shape. I think we may be at a kind of a low ebb right now. We're sort of a discipline. You know, we've got 2 or 3 journals. We've got some professional associations that if we don't dominate, we have at least have a measure of influence in. There are divisions within those, AECT and the AERA, the International Society for Performance Instruction. We beginning to develop a body of literature. We have identifiable people in our discipline. We now have people who, for the last 25 years, have degrees in our field. So we have a discipline. I think that we need to, and this I guess sounds like the old man, I think we need not to lose sight of our origins. I think we need to realize that there's nothing sacred about any particular instructional intervention, that the utility of a particular intervention under a given set of circumstances is something that is demonstrable, or the non-utility is demonstrable, and that we ought to stay flexible with respect to the kinds of things that we do, the problems that we address, and the data that we will accept as an indication that we have been a success or failure in those endeavors. I think if we do that, we're probably going to be around for a long time. It's a very practical approach. It's my advice, very pragmatic. I'm not very theoretical. I really don't have a great deal of interest in the refinement of models unless that refinement can be shown to have practical value. Education, by definition, is an applied endeavor, and therefore our research should be highly applied. I think that if we get in conflict, as I've begun to see with the constructivist issues, that will be counterproductive, that doesn't really help us very much. I could go off on a long dialogue or monologue, I guess, on what I think the constructivist view has contributed both positively and negatively to human resources development ambitions, but I won't do that this time. I think that whatever approaches you take, if you attend to the gathering of data, whether that's hard numerical, objectively collected data, or some kind of qualitative data, or data that is a consequence of several steps removed from where you make the inference to whether you gather the data, as long as this is done in an orderly, logical, and defensible way, that you're on the right track. I think if ISD keeps those things in mind, it will continue to be a growing discipline and a discipline of greater influence. We have a great deal more influence in the world today than we had in 1965. And that's a consequence of the kind of programs that we and many others around the country have.
You're involved right now in an exciting new area, distance education, and collaborating with people all over the world. Is distance education bad, or what are your thoughts about that in our field?
Well, when FSU began to examine distance education, which was about 5 years ago, I guess, task force headed by Roger Kaufman, appointed by then President Dale Lick, were asked to look into both the needs in Florida and the nation and the opportunities in the countrywide. And then having looked at those things to examine what were the strengths that Florida State University brought to such an initiative. I didn't have any interest in it at all in the early days. I was asked to serve with Roger on his task force, and I wasn't a very good member. I didn't attend most of the meetings, and they worked diligently, thanks to him, and began to collect a great deal of information, which I at least read if I didn't participate in the gathering of it. And as that began to unfold, as the information came in, 2 or 3 things occurred to him and to me and to the others. And that is that, one, there was an urgent need for non-place-bound, non-time-bound educational opportunities for people in the world, and especially in the state of Florida. We're one of the lowest baccalaureate degree producers on a per capita basis in the nation. Don't know exactly why that is, but it's fact. We are a state that on a per capita basis, again, is one of the lowest, 49th or 50th in its expenditure for higher education. Maybe those 2 things go together. There are a great many adults, some of whom have completed, or what we say completed college, have a degree, 1 or more degrees, and thousands of people who have some college, but who have not completed the equivalent of a baccalaureate degree. Job needs change. Information, the knowledge base is changing exponentially. It's very difficult to keep up with those things without some kind of continuing education. It is difficult to impossible for people to get to an organized institutional environment where they can keep up to date, where they can continue their education, where they can increase their skills or change their skills. And Florida has probably been as effective as any state in the union in putting community colleges within 45 minutes or so of every citizen. So there's no community colleges that are not within a commute of a citizen if the person has the time and an automobile to get to those places. But a great many people don't. They have jobs full-time, they have children to look after, they have time where around their job on a highly flexible basis or around the care of their children or looking after a household, they could continue study. They could continue to increase their skills. And many such people are motivated to do that, it would appear. So as the study progressed, and we brought into that the changing technology, which is relatively new. You know, the last year's graduating class didn't start as freshmen with access to the World Wide Web and the internet. It's that new. When you take the changing technology, the very low cost of microcomputers, the ubiquity with which information is available and can be made available, the fact that such resources can be available at the workplace or in a local school environment on a time-flexible basis, or even at home for a great many people. As you begin to put those things together and you have you have a need on the one hand, and you have an opportunity of satisfying that on the other hand through the technology, and if educational institutions, not just Florida State, but many, will begin to organize the skills and content that they convey in a residential basis to be made available on a asynchronous, time-free, place-free basis, then the changes in educational opportunity nationwide, indeed worldwide, can change in unbelievable ways. I think that that's worth undertaking. I think that I firmly believe by now that FSU has a role to play in that, if not unique, at least a significant role. I think the thing that we bring to bear on this is our experience in instructional system design. A lot of institutions, private and public, are making distance education available at varying costs to people in lots of different areas and fields today. And I've looked at quite a lot of that. And most of it is essentially taking the best of the lecture or the textbook and making it available in a more flexible way over the microcomputer in your study at home or in your library or in your office. The material is not designed to be instructionally effective. It's not designed to be what they say is user-friendly. It's not designed so that you know a person meeting certain entry-level qualifications, if they proceed through the learning as it's organized, will come out with the skills and with the knowledge. And I think that's what instructional design can bring to it. And so I think that FSU's distance learning program, if we adhere and make the effort to apply those tools to distance learning programs, will make a singular contribution, and an important one in the country. Costs money to do it, it takes time, it's a lot more trouble, but I believe it's worthwhile, and that's what we're committed to do. Hopefully that will continue through the years ahead. The other side of that coin, Dan, is that if we develop, as we are now trying to do, education and training programs along the lines that I have described, and we make these available off campus in a flexible way to students who can't come to us, I think we're going to see success data that will have a major impact on what happens in our classrooms. You know, for 30 years or more, we have been talking to our own colleagues, our own faculty members, about if you would do certain kinds of things, you could decrease your failure rates, you could increase your performance level of students, you could increase the effectiveness and efficiency of residential campus instruction. And some programs, some departments, some faculty members have in fact used those tools, made those applications, and gotten those results. But the vast majority have not. Whereas in distance learning, because of the way it's set up at Florida State, that's the way it will be developed. And if we get sufficient payoff with the non-residential student, then I think the data will be impressive for the deans and the department heads and the academic vice presidents and the faculty members, so that we'll begin to see a greater application of those ideas and those tools in conventional residential instruction. We're already seeing that happen. And so I don't want to appear overly dramatic, but I think what's happening in distance education today with the technology, both the hardware and the soft technology, may well change the nature of education in the years ahead in some fairly dramatic ways. One could hope.
You have particularly impressed me with being a man of vision. How does one develop a mindset of having vision?
What was it Robert Kennedy said? I've forgotten. Look at things as they are and say, why can't they change? He said it so elegantly, and I've paraphrased very poorly, but again, it goes back to deliberately deciding what you want to do for fun. You know, how do you maximize the kicks you get out of what you do on a daily basis? And that means, at least from my perspective, that means you take on problems that aren't easy to solve. This is not tic-tac-toe. These are very complex problems. They require looking at things very differently. They require, I think, an entrepreneurial character. They require the ability to engage in political persuasion and indeed manipulation. As a matter of fact, I suspect the change of any well-entrenched societal infrastructure can't be done without those kinds of thoughts and those kinds of manipulative approaches. The vision comes from what it is you decide you want to do. And if you want to do an immediate thing, a simple thing, doesn't require a great deal of vision. If you aspire to play God, then it takes a lot of vision. And if you want to change the world, then you have to think at it, you have to have a pretty wide-angle lens. And I think most of my colleagues in this field do. I think they are interested in long-range purposes and long-range goals. I've always thought that I could do anything that I set my mind to. After 35 years of trying to reform education, I'm about to revise my estimate of what I can do, at least. But somebody will, one of these days. And Dan, I think that's your last question. I've talked as long as I want to, already said more than I know, and
Well, if I could, I have one more I was going to ask you.
He's pushing.
I can see why these things go so long.
As a good university of graduate of the University of Oklahoma, how could you go to Oklahoma State University? How has that impacted you at all?
Yeah, it was one of our social evils. I was stuck going to a cow college, which, by the way, I have no regrets after the fact, whereas the sons and daughters of the doctors and lawyers in my little hometown and the people who owned the Chevrolet agency all went to OU, and they sipped tea and got mediocre educations. Oh, I have no regrets in going to Oklahoma A&M College, as it was called, when I was a student there. But I've known a few fine people from the other university as well. Thank you very much, Dan, for your time. Well, I hope you edited out a good bit of that. That was too much rambling.